Good morning. Thank you, Bob, and good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. As Bob said, I'm going to spend a little while talking about the topic of this session, which is corporate responsibility at the crossroads of rhetoric and substance. And the jumping off point for this talk is an article I wrote for Quartz with the title, "The Corporate Responsibility Facade is Starting to Crumble." So I'm going to talk about three things. One, what I believe is the state of play today with corporate responsibility efforts. And I'm very much focused on big business and multinational companies. I'm then going to talk about why we're in this situation now. And then the third part, I'm going to talk about what this means, what these changes mean, I believe, for the future of ethical leadership. So the first question is, where are we? And I think what you can say is that the corporate responsibility / ESG / sustainability agenda has made really remarkable progress over the past decade, and particularly during the last 5 years. And one thing you see in particular is a proliferation of new standards and efforts. We can define and understand what we mean by corporate responsibility and sustainability in a way that was very, very difficult a decade ago. There've been the emergence of an absolute plethora of voluntary standards and efforts that corporations can subscribe to. I'm thinking of things like the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights. They've only been around since 2011. I'm thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals from 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement. We've also seen a massive emergence of investor interest in this topic, along with a lot of evidence that prioritizing good performance on environmental, social, and governance issues correlates with good financial performance over the long term. So we seem to be in this amazing position for corporate sustainability, where it is mainstream and front and center on the agenda in a way that it has not been before. And all of that is true. On the other hand, what I have found from my work with companies is that when you look under the hood of what is going on inside organizations, the picture, unfortunately, is still rather more depressing. Very often, sustainability or CSR teams are quite small, they're quite powerless, they're underfunded. Something else you might see is if you read the company's standard financial and risk disclosures, and then you look at its CSR report, you get the impression you're reading about two completely different companies. So you still see this issue that sustainability and CSR is very siloed, and that companies very often are behaving as if the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And you see that particularly with the disconnect between a lot of rhetoric, a lot of commitments, a lot of goals around sustainability, but then political lobbying and corporate spending very often directly undermining that CSR agenda. So still really this situation where sustainability is siloed and it is treated overall as a marketing effort. Over the past couple of years, though, we've seen this really start to change. It started with Larry Fink, the chairman of BlackRock in 2018, wrote his annual letter to CEOs saying the purpose of business is not just to make money, but to make a contribution to society. And then the Business Roundtable, the largest CEO network in the US, last year, about a year ago, called an end to shareholder value. And really said now that that businesses should be run in the interests of all stakeholders. There's been a 1-year anniversary of that statement and a lot of commentary saying that the Business Roundtable members really didn't mean what they were saying, they didn't consult their boards, and they haven't really made any difference to strategy. And a lot of critics have said that therefore that statement that businesses should be managed in the interests of all stakeholders was meaningless. I would regard this rather as the beginning of a new era of debate and discussion. So by bringing the issues of sustainability and ESG into the mainstream, we've started to see these tensions that I flagged being highlighted. And I think in future, it will be impossible to treat sustainability efforts and sustainability reporting as performative marketing efforts. all these tensions are being highlighted, but they're also being accelerated by the coronavirus. So the pandemic is one of the things that has brought to attention all these tensions, but I think there are also longer term trends. We've seen this growth in transparency where massive internet adoption, including in the global south, massive social media adoption that is still going on, has really meant that today company leaders must behave as if everything they say or do might become public knowledge. We've seen, in addition to that, employees like leaking data, leaking damaging internal emails, damaging details of internal meetings, damaging information about decision-making or abuses of power into the public domain. So a lot of companies now really needing to deal with their ethical challenges, and what they're doing that they would rather keep secret is being brought into the public domain, and they are therefore being left open to the judgment of the public. So this rise in transparency, I think, is super significant, and it means that company leaders increasingly need to be responding to critiques from the public domain and from their own employees, and really trying to build a very different relationship with society. At the same time, we've also seen this acceleration of popular protest and activism. CSIS has shown that popular protest in all countries in the world has grown by 11.5% annually since 2009. So there are a lot of angry people on the streets. We've obviously seen this very strikingly in the US with the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, but this is happening globally. People and populations very, very upset, very angry about self-interested, corrupt and inefficient governments. The target of these protests is government, not business, but of course business gets brought in to these conversations, and particularly because an increasing number of businesses have shown themselves willing to participate in activism and increasingly using this rhetoric that they care about more than just making money. They have values, they have purpose, they care about corporate responsibility. And so even though there are these arguments that these leaders meant this rhetorically, they meant this as a marketing effort, they can't keep it as a marketing effort because there is an incredible amount of focus on corporate hypocrisy and on corporate ethics. I teach at NYU, and my MBA students are incredibly focused on corporate hypocrisy. It is really, really striking. When they are deciding where they want to work, they do not look at the CSR report. They don't look at what the company says it's doing about sustainability. They look at things like what political money the company is spending and what kind of companies it does business with. You saw, for example, a lot of protests at Harvard Law School recently because there was a recruitment effort by Paul Weiss, the law firm, and Paul Weiss works with the oil and gas sector, and all these prestigious Harvard Law students objecting to Paul Weiss recruiting at their school. So all in all, we have really high stakes today for business leaders who can no longer manage their corporate responsibility efforts as agendas that can be separate from the core business. All of this, I would argue, has really profound implications for the future of ethical leadership. Already before the pandemic, we saw that an increasing amount of corporate value is from intangible assets, things like network effects, reputation, IP. So this really means that the idea that you can separate what's internal and external is no longer really meaningful. The idea of negative externalities, things that the company doesn't need to worry about, is increasingly meaningless in an era of climate change and pandemics and inequality and social protest. There is a far tighter and less predictable feedback loop between a company's actions, its impact, and its reputation. And I would argue that what this means is that organizational leadership is going to become far more a matter of influencing diffuse networks than exerting control over human and financial resources. And the pandemic has accelerated many of these trends, most strikingly through remote work. And remote work is super interesting because it provides enormous opportunities for inclusion and more flexible work for people with family obligations, also, I think, enables more transparent decision making and clear norm setting, and reduces the value of things like charisma and power and office politics. Transparency, that I've mentioned already, is here to stay, will be amplified even more as Gen Z digital natives enter the workplace and understand that by using and deploying information publicly, they can correct some of the power imbalances in today's companies. I think we'll see far more focus on employee rights and the dignity of work. I understand the job market is terrible now, but I think, showing that, everything that has been shown about essential workers and the lack of healthcare in the US and so on, these are tensions that will need to be resolved in the long term. I don't think that we will be able to have these working models for the long term because employees just aren't going to put up with it. We see a lot of rhetoric around diversity and inclusion, and then a lot of people calling out that hypocrisy. And because older generations and younger generations have very different attitudes to diversity and inclusion, I think there'll be a lot of tension around those issues, showing up as hierarchical tension in the short term. Today's leaders will also need to manage this pressure over social and political activism. I don't think that's going away, but it introduces a lot of debates and tensions about the role of business and the role of government. And so I think leaders in future, it's all about influence, it's all about listening, it's all about understanding. It is far less about top-down control. We all need to get better at working with people who have different values, beliefs, and expectations than us. And I think successful leaders of the future will be those who make fewer assumptions, are better at listening, and are far less obsessed with power, and understand the dynamics of influence. I'll stop there and very happy to take questions or comments from anyone in the audience. Hi, Roy.
Hi. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think that was really interesting. And, I latched onto a few points there. One, being social media, kind of shedding light on a lot of these issues, and, being like sunlight being the best disinfecting, kind of like exposing a lot of things. And then also you were talking about how companies are more focused on all of their stakeholders. And I think I was wondering kind of the connection between those, not just like exposing people and everything like that, but actually the ability of these companies to engage and talk to and create a community around all of these stakeholders, and how that kind of plays into this.
Well, I think, you've seen obviously a lot of rhetoric around listening to stakeholders. The Business Roundtable statement that I mentioned says we should run business in the interests of all stakeholders. What the Business Roundtable does not address is what happens when those stakeholder agendas contradict. So, for example, when the interests of shareholders about maximizing profit might contradict with the interests of employees about having more stable employment and better salaries and better healthcare. And so I think companies are needing to manage and prioritize those tensions. And in the context of social media, they're having to manage and balance and prioritize those tensions in full public view. So I would argue that the ability to control the narrative about you has really gone away. And one of the big stakeholder groups, probably the most important stakeholder group after shareholders, is employees. Now, not all employees have power, but what you see, I think, is employees using and deploying information to hold their leaders to account. I'm thinking about things like the climate protests at Amazon. Amazon employees broke their confidentiality agreements to express their concern over Bezos's commitments to climate. And I think the Amazon climate commitments also highlight another tension, which is that Amazon invested $10 billion to fight climate change, but still carried on providing cloud services to oil and gas companies. And you see that kind of one hand not knowing what the other thing is doing over and over again. You see this in banking. You see banks making, massive noise about their sustainable finance commitments and their green energy funds. And at the same time, they're funding oil and gas projects. You see pharmaceutical companies advertising perhaps contraception, and then business associations that fund politicians that undermine women's reproductive rights. So those tensions, that idea that we can kind of pitch out CSR as a marketing effort and then keep doing what we're doing, I think that's going away. And so the tension point is hypocrisy. The stage is the public domain. And this, I believe, puts a very, very different pressure on leaders and requires very, very different leadership skills.
Thank you.
Alison, I have a question, and it's somewhat related, but as a small business, we have 14 employees, although we own quite a bit of real estate around the United States, and we have a couple of hundred shareholders or investors that are on our platform. How do we best reach out and do an analysis and get a feeling for what our stakeholders, we talk to our employees about it, but our investors, what's the best way to reach out to them and find out what their expectations are from a company standpoint? Do you have a recommendation or thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, the rather too obvious answer is ask them.
Right, but do you know how to ask them? How to best ask them? Is it?
I think you can, you can do surveys, you can do public domain results. I would suggest interviewing them. Okay. I don't know if people are on the line are familiar, but any kind of sustainability or corporate responsibility effort involves something called materiality. So that is finding out which issues are relevant. And you're supposed to do that by consulting with your internal and your external stakeholders. So I think going through that exercise, finding out what your shareholders think, finding out what they care about will enable you to target the issues and strategy that are most relevant for you and ensure that you are doing this and really addressing the needs of your stakeholders. So I think there is a need to undergo a very deliberate stakeholder mapping and consultation exercise. That takes place in big companies, but I think it is equally, if not more important, in small companies. And I would emphasize, it sounds as if you're already talking to your employees, but talking to your employees and finding out what they care about, what they're expecting, what they're inspired by is incredibly important at this point.
Right. Well, I totally agree with what you said about the tension between old and young, the employees and the age difference and their perceptions and maybe our perceptions as older people, and so I think that communication and that conversation is extremely valuable, especially to, I think the older said it resets our expectations and expands the conversation for sure. So
yeah, and I think there's often a perception among young people that it'll be all right when the old people get out of the way, but I don't think that's true. I think what we are in a situation of is that purpose and values and what companies should be doing beyond making money is a point of debate and discussion in a way it hasn't been before. And we all need to get better at working with people that have different values and different ethics and come from different cultures and have different expectations. So that has got harder, opinions have got more diverse, but I think all of this leads to the importance of negotiation and listening and the other things I talked about for the future of ethical leadership.
Hi, Alison.
Hi.
So I have to, I guess, push back a little. It's not more of a question, but more of a counterpoint to this argument. I don't think this is a new argument. We've seen this in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the whole notion that we should focus on the stakeholder, not the shareholder. But without the shareholder, there is no stakeholder, right? The entrepreneurs and the shareholders are the ones that are taking the risk. Therefore, they reap the rewards. I'm not saying that they should act in unethical forms, but corporations' interest or responsibility should be to their customer, their employee, and their shareholders. I don't think that corporations have a responsibility to society per se, beyond delivering a product that society needs or that the market demands, and they fulfill that need. Other than that, I mean, at the end of the day, it's math. These companies have to do what they have to do to make a profit so they can fund future activities and pay employees in the future, or else they're just going to go out of business. There was a couple things that you said. Popular protest is on the rise. I think right now we're living in this cancel culture where if these companies start capitulating or kowtowing to the mobs, that they will never satisfy that. No matter what these companies do, they will never satisfy everybody's activism. So like we're ostracizing oil companies as if they are the enemy. This is absurd. You know, we use energy every day. I think 99% of us drive a car. And that's kind of my point. It's, who are you satisfying? Companies have no values, people have values. So I think it's a very difficult path to embark on. And I think you nailed it on the head when you said that CSR is more of a marketing effort. And I think that's what it is, because companies see that this cancel culture is on the rise. And then so, hey, we're going to do our part. But at the end of the day, what are we going to do? Defund or not fund or invest in oil companies that provide us with energy? I don't understand this concept. Yeah.
All right, so you're right that this is a very long debate. There have been a lot of 50 years of Milton Friedman's famous 1970 article comments. So yes, it is a long debate. I mean, I would tend to argue that Milton Friedman won this conversation, and he's really the figurehead. He gets misinterpreted, but we have seen a very robust focus on exactly what you're talking about, exclusive shareholder value for a very, very long time. And I think most of us, maybe not you, would agree that that has brought us to maybe not the best place. And particularly what we have seen is corporations taking control of the political agenda. So I take your point that demonizing oil and gas may not be the most productive thing, but oil and gas's lobbying activities have undermined progress on climate change. And they are now in a very, very difficult decision point where they need to navigate a future that reduces fossil fuels and build up the rest of their business. That's very risky, but industries die. I mean, I think the other point I'd make is that it is above all today's long-term shareholders that are pushing for more of a consideration of stakeholders. So when you have shareholders, as you would have it, arguing against their own interest and for broader consideration of what is going on in society, then I think you have something very, very profound going on. I think you're exactly right that these tensions are very, very difficult to navigate, and that many companies have raised expectations, not characterized as being purely about cancel culture, which I think is a very specifically American issue right now and relates to some of our political dynamics. These things are going on globally. Maplecroft, beginning of the year, predicted that there would be popular protests in 60% of all countries this year. People are very, very angry, and they are angry at the government. And big business is getting caught up in these dynamics. So if shareholder value was doing a better job, then I don't think the world would have got the way it is. Companies are making these rhetorical commitments for a reason, and I think that they are scared. And so they may have intended CSR to be a marketing effort. I don't think they can treat it as a marketing effort anymore. I think we're seeing the transparency and professionalization of what we mean by social responsibility. And ultimately, we might argue that all these things are in the interests of long-term shareholders as well. If you have a very transparent environment where reputation is very valuable, then that will affect shareholder value. So perhaps it's a tautology, perhaps it's a circular argument, but a strategy of prioritizing short-term shareholder value, I would argue, has not been that successful, or has left us to a situation where our social and environmental externalities are so huge that we really need to think about doing something differently.
Well, don't you think that it is circular though? Because the stakeholders' interest is the shareholders' interest. So you wouldn't have an Apple. I'm sorry?
I mean, maybe over the long term. So I think we have maybe a question about the time horizon.
But even in the short term,
in the long term, but what we see is most corporations obsessed with quarterly reporting and short-term shareholder value.
Well, because they have an obligation, but I'm sure the employee is obsessed with their hourly wage or their salary that they make sure they get paid on the 15th and the 1st of each month. I think we're only looking at one side of the argument. For example, you mentioned the corporation's political power. Well, employees have a lot of political power and, for example, union activities, right? And they lobby the government for their interests. Well, is it not okay for a corporation to be able to lobby in their behalf too and their interest? I think that we're only looking at one side of the argument. Like I said, there's plenty of employee activism. I can't speak for what's going on in other parts of the country. Or the world. I'm sorry. I'm focusing on here in the U.S. So you mentioned Amazon, for example, right? These employees clearly violated an agreement that they had, and then divulged all this information that was supposed to be confidential. I mean, that's not okay.
It's the reality. Whether you think it's okay or not, is rather beside the point. I think it is a reality. I also would say that union power is massively diminished in the US. I don't think employee power and union power and corporate power are remotely comparable. And if you're saying that employees are powerful, why should they not have a say in shaping what their employers are doing and where their employers are spending money?
Well, they could. They call those co-ops. You know, people have the freedom to engage in a co-op. Everybody invests their money. Everybody owns equal shares of this company, and then everybody has a voice. If not, the employees themselves can invest in the company and have a voice. But the reason why union activities might be lower in the United States is because they already have lobbied for so much regulation and so many laws that the need for unions has kind of diminished because we have so many laws in our books that protect the employee.
Well,
In
I've
fact,
seen a lot of employees dying of COVID because they get laid off and don't have healthcare. So I'm not entirely sure I agree with you. Bob, it looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, I think this is, you can see that this can go on for a long time. And I actually think it's time that we do get into what is really going on here. And to me, it seems like there's this false dichotomy in bottom lines. Like, for instance, in order to take care of something other than what was considered the traditional bottom line, making money, you have to compromise that bottom line. But what I'm understanding is that, and it's basically, I think, due to, if you will, basically communication technology, that there's so much transparency that everybody can see into what's going on, that it actually the bottom lines, if you will, they're inextricable from each other. And I do think it seems to make sense that looking at short-term versus long-term is fairly significant. And in my mind, that's where the ethical leadership has to communicate in a way that is clear, that makes the stockholders, if you will, if we're talking about a public company, comfortable in believing that this quarter or even the next quarter or even this year is only part of a bigger picture. But what I'm wondering is in this is, what are the CFOs saying? Are they coming in and saying, hey, we're okay, we're doing what we should be doing? This strategy of bringing other people's voices and looking at the stakeholders makes sense. It's going to be good for our company. It is a smart, sustainable approach. That I'm interested in the CFO. What are we getting any feedback? Is there any research that's saying that that this is smart business?
There is plenty of research. There's an organization called FCLT Global based in Boston that does a lot of work on long-term thinking in financial services. I think very often what you see is leadership teams know that they need to plan for the long term. And by the way, the churn of big business through the S&P 500 has massively accelerated over the past 50 years. So that focus on short-term shareholder value certainly seems to be driving a lot of companies out of business. So I think leaders recognize this tension between the short term and long term, but there are very strong defaults, most strikingly quarterly reporting, that mean it is very, very difficult to keep your eye on the long term. And that is precisely why Paul Polman, when he became CEO of Unilever, one of the first things he did was to say, we're not going to engage in quarterly reporting anymore, so we can keep our eye on the longer term. The other value, sort of relevant point I'd make from the perspective of the CEO is back to that data point I shared when I was talking. 61% now of the value of the S&P 500 is in intangibles, network effects, IP, data, reputation. So even if we're arguing it's a circular argument, shareholder and stakeholder value converge over the long term, that means that that ability to leverage value from those intangible areas, there's far less direct cause and effect in terms of what decision makers are doing and how they realize value.
Right. Thus the need for articulate leadership.
And leadership that is less focused on top-down control and more focused on the ability to harness and leverage influence for the benefit of the organization.
Right. How far in left field am I to think that if Milton Friedman were to rewrite that article, he would say times have changed and what is good for the stakeholder is also good for the shareholder?
Well, it's an interesting point. I would not want to put words in the mouth of Milton Friedman, but if you actually read his original article, he says, you know, the social responsibility of business is to maximize profit for shareholders. He also says that companies should pay attention to law, but also ethical custom. He doesn't just talk about legal requirements. He says if there are ethical norms in society, then business should observe those. So one thing Milton Friedman might say is that ethical norms and customs, how young people feel, where they want to work, the public's belief about what a company should do to be environmentally and socially responsible, that has changed. Norms have changed. So I would say a company that wants to be competitive, that wants to drive value, therefore needs to pay attention to the interests of all stakeholders.
Right. And that is not in disregard to the traditional bottom line.
Right. I mean, you know, the question is, I suppose, how you get from A to B and how this determines your strategy and whether the best results you can possibly make next quarter is a way to the best way to listen to all your stakeholders and keep an eye on the long term.
Thanks.
I wanted to add one point, and that is the following. I think that there was a comment made earlier that business, you know, doesn't have to be a value-driven entity, right? That corporations don't have values. They, you know, humans have values. But I would go on to say that corporations, businesses, and any organization of humans together does have values. You know, they're simply an extension. They act on behaviors that are coming from values. So an organization, I would just want to say that an organization can have values. It doesn't have to, certainly, but it can. And I do think that going forward, we're seeing a lot of dismay, I think, through the angry mobs, or as we might call them, the people of this world, that, you know, we're sick of the way things are. We're sick of the status quo. And you're seeing that obviously in this, you know, the political climate of the past 5 years globally. But also you are seeing that in terms of humans just wanting to have different options. So I think that what we can do is we can continue looking backwards and saying, this is how things are done. This is how things must be done. Or conversely, we can say, things can be done differently. They can, you know, they don't have to be, but they can, and they probably should if we're looking that we, you know, we want to see change in our planet. So yeah, basically, like I'm coming from the perspective of a small business that has CSR, you know, within it, you know, written into the very foundations of this company. obviously we're very agile and quick start. And I recognize that for a large corporation, it would be a lot more difficult, but I think that we evolve, humans evolve, and corporations, as it follows, must evolve as well. So yeah.
It's an interesting question, right? About whether organizations can have values, because we have this concept in the US, at least, that corporations are people. There is an idea of corporate personhood. Corporations can give to political parties. So we are treating corporations as if they are a person that can have beliefs and agendas and values. The reality, of course, is that corporations aren't people. They are social systems in which power and influence and strategy are negotiated. And so whether we like it or not, I would say that the dynamics of protest and activism and transparency are vastly affecting that negotiation, and they are vastly affecting the power balance inside organizations, where leaders used to be able to control information, control decision making, and there wasn't that much that anyone more could do about it, and control the narrative about them. And I think that control has been lost. I think the new world is very fraught. It's very stressful. I do take the point that there is maybe no good way forward here. There are a lot of tensions, but that is the world we're in. And we may, much as some of us may wish to go back to organizations where top-down control would work, I don't think we're there. And so a new form of leadership is necessitated. I think ultimately, yes, we would like to see all these things being baked into corporate governance processes and the legal system and so on. And people in my class, when I'm teaching these topics, very often say, oh, I don't believe in this stakeholder stuff, and nothing will happen unless there's a law. I agree with that, but laws just don't spring fully formed out of nowhere. They come from social pressure, which leads to political pressure, which leads to decision making. So I think just sort of saying, well, that's not the law, so nothing can possibly change, misunderstands how social change and moral revolutions occur. And arguably, we're in the middle of a moral revolution right now.
Well, that's just it. And I think that we as humans can do the bare minimum, and we as companies can do the bare minimum. We don't have to at this moment in time. There are no laws, right? There are certifications that one can, voluntarily take, a business or corporation can voluntarily take. And I hope to see more companies doing that, because I do believe as we go forward and as things get more and more tenuous, which it seems increasingly they will, that this will have to be mandated at a certain point. And so I do think that companies not only can get ahead in terms of, this is sort of the public opinion right now, is that people do want to see their companies taking a stand on important issues, and not just in rhetoric, but in substance. But also I do believe you can get ahead of this curve by actually going forward and getting the B Corp certification, or literally just leading with this idea that money is not the only thing, that there are many other important factors to take into account. Like, will we have a planet left from which to extract all of these important things that we need, right? If we don't actually do this in a way that makes sense, that is sustainable for populations growing and the demand that they will place, right? So we can hold ourselves to higher standards as human beings and as companies. And I just think that right now, maybe it's not something that is being mandated upon us, but very soon it could be,
Exactly. I agree with everything you said. And there's a question in the chat I can see about the rise of the benefit and certified B corporations as different forms of corporate governance to be accountable to all stakeholders. Hugely significant, hugely positive. And I think the growth in momentum of those new corporate governance models speaks to this need that they focus on short-term shareholder value is not serving us very well, and also may undermine commercial performance over the long term. So there is no, I think, big mystery to why more multinationals are making those commitments to become certified B Corps, and I would expect to see that accelerate, especially for consumer-facing businesses over the next decade. So I think it's hugely positive, and I think those companies will benefit from being able to attract and retain the best young employees out there. There's also a question about meritocracy and how this affects the entire discussion. So I would see that showing up most obviously in the conversation around diversity and inclusion and the background in the US of systemic discrimination, which has had a very, very long history. This is a very, very live conversation right now. And I think really talks directly to this situation. What you saw over the summer, a lot of Black Lives Matter protests. Most corporations then went ahead and made public statements in support of those protests, which already tells you how much the world has changed. There were these protests in 2015 and corporations did not speak out in favor of Black Lives Matter. So just in that 5-year period, you've really seen this change. I think it does meet the standards of a moral revolution that I'm talking about. But after all these statements were made, there was then an enormous amount of commentary on the diversity of these companies' boards and what they are really doing to support the education system and the pipeline and how they are recruiting. And so again, that real call for something that is beyond a marketing statement to try and get more, more customers, and really it needing to, those statements needing to be reflected in everything that the organization does. There's a final question, and I know we need to wrap, about who does corporate sustainability better than most. People always name Unilever, they always name Patagonia. I think everybody has room for improvement. I don't know of any company that is good across all issues. I would encourage companies to prioritize the issues that are most strategically relevant for them, their existential issues, and to take action there. And then I think we need to close, Bill, right?
Yeah, thank you so much. Alison, Bob, you want to? You're on mute though, Bob.
Bob, you need to take yourself off mute.
Cambry, do you want to get in a last comment?
I had a question. It might open up some more conversation. So I'll ask the question to Alison. If you want to take it offline, that's fine. I was just going to ask a question. I think I really appreciate it. You spoke about a world where there's kind of an increasing public priority of CSR and ESG transparency, and I think, and also leadership thereof. So, and a lot of us are going to be leaders within companies, within corporations. Some of us are leaders outside too. So, but one thing that does feel very true is that we're consumers. And so one thing that I was curious about is, how have you seen, or how do consumers take kind of consumer-focused actions that build accountability in really creative or innovative ways that become a part of a business's critical path? So I really appreciate some of the conversations around protest. I think that that's a really important mechanism and can be seen as an important mechanism of disruption. There's also this kind of idea of transformation and transformation within organizations or businesses, so on and so forth. And so I'm curious about kind of where have you seen that? I've heard some really interesting ideas around saying, one way that consumers can take these kind of consumer-focused actions that build innovative accountability is to think about e-commerce, right? E-commerce distributors, the Walmarts, the Jets, so on and so forth, and thinking about bringing to them the idea of their algorithms, the idea of who surfaces first versus last, when you're actually looking to purchase a product. So that's a critical path of the way that they do business. It is the center of their business. And there's some very interesting ways to think about how do you encourage governance of those in a way that really leans toward ethical leadership as well. So it's kind of I guess a question there. And
yeah, it's actually right. What a critical question. And I have done famously what my colleagues would tell you they would predict, and that is I ran us over. But Bill, how does Cambry connect with Alison regarding that?
Yeah, so you all are, as panelists, are connected by email, Cambry. I think you're included in that, correct? So I think the best way would be to maybe follow up via email, and then the both of you could talk about that. I would really love to hear the answer to that and continue this conversation. I know, because I guess it's a good feeling.
I have 10 seconds on it, and then we'll close.
Sure.
So I think the general idea is, you know, consumers say they care about this stuff, but will they pay more? That's kind of the question. And people say one thing and maybe do something else. I think as a consumer, it can feel really overwhelming about, you know, you want to make ethical purchases. Should it be local? Should it be organic? Did slave labor make your food? You know, there's so many criteria. I think it's really overwhelming to try and shop ethically. But I think the most interesting area, in addition to the decision making and the algorithms and the marketing that Cambry mentioned, is the pressure on the supply chain. And you really see a lot of big businesses now start to push down to their suppliers these standards. And I think that is what will move these forces from big business to small business and could have a really profound impact over the long term. But much more to say, Cambry. Let's take it offline and we can close.
Okay, and this session has been recorded and it will be formatted and so on and available to all of you. And hopefully it'll be a tool to take it to your class if you're in school, or maybe to take it to your colleagues, maybe even to send it to your stakeholders as a prompt for furthering the discussion. So Alison, thank you so much. Panel, thank you so much. We did what we were supposed to do and get this discourse going, and let's hope we can take it beyond this session. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.